She's not dead. The morning sun filtered through the oak trees of Willowbrook Cemetery, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. A crowd of about 30 people stood in silence, dressed in black, gathered around an ornate mahogany casket lined with cream-colored silk. Inside lay Margaret Holloway, 72 years old, her silver hair carefully arranged, her hands folded peacefully across her chest. At the head of the gathering stood her son, Richard Holloway. At 58, Richard cut an imposing figure in his custom-tailored black suit. His hair, still dark, with just a touch of distinguished gray at the temples, was slicked back perfectly. His face, handsome but hardened by years of corporate battles, showed no emotion. He stood with his shoulders squared, checking his platinum watch every few minutes, waiting for the service to begin. Richard had built his father's modest pharmaceutical company into a billion-dollar empire. He was known for his ruthlessness in business, his emotional distance, and his ability to make difficult decisions without hesitation. Even now, at his own mother's funeral, he seemed more focused on the schedule than on grief. The funeral director, a thin man in his 60s, with kind eyes, approached Richard quietly. "Mr. Holloway, we're ready to begin whenever you'd like." Richard nodded curtly. "Let's get started. I have a board meeting at 3. The director's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing. He'd seen all kinds of grief in his career, and he knew that some people buried their pain beneath layers of control and routine. As the director moved toward the small podium to begin the service, a loud rumbling sound interrupted the solemn quiet. An orange garbage truck came bouncing down the narrow cemetery road, its brakes squealing as it came to a sudden stop, about 20 yards from the funeral gathering. Richard's jaw tightened. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice sharp with irritation. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a man who looked to be in his early 60s. He was lean and weathered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of decades working outdoors. His gray hair stuck out from under an old baseball cap, and his orange work uniform was faded and worn. His face was creased with deep lines around his eyes and mouth, the kind that came from a lifetime of smiling. His hands were calloused and strong, with the hands of a man who'd never been afraid of honest work. His name was Frank Delgado, and he'd been collecting garbage on the north side of Willowbrook for 37 years. Frank walked toward the funeral gathering with quick, urgent steps, his work boots crunching on the gravel path. Several mourners turned to stare, their expressions ranging from confusion to offense. "Excuse me," Frank called out, his voice rough but earnest. "Excuse me, please." Richard stepped forward, his face darkening. "This is a private service. We need to leave now." "I can't do that, sir," Frank said, breathing hard as he reached the edge of the gathering. "Not until I—" "Security," Richard barked, looking around for help. "Please, just listen to me," Frank insisted, his brown eyes intense and pleading. "That woman in the casket, Mrs. Holloway, she's not dead." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed nervously. Richard's face flushed with anger. "How dare you?" Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is my mother's funeral. If you don't leave immediately, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace." Frank stood his ground, though his hands trembled slightly. "Sir, I understand how this looks, but I've known your mother for 15 years. I collect her trash every Wednesday morning at 6:30, and we talk. We've talked every Wednesday for 15 years. My mother didn't know garbage collectors," Richard said dismissively. "You're clearly confused, or trying to cause some kind of scene. Either way, you need to go." "She knows me," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying a dignity that made several mourners pause. "And I know her well enough to know that she wouldn't leave this world without saying certain things, without settling certain matters, and well enough to know when something isn't right." Richard took a step closer, his eyes cold. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you check," Frank said simply. "Before you bury her, just check." "This is insane," Richard said, shaking his head. "The doctors confirmed her death. The hospital called me 48 hours ago. My mother had a massive stroke. She was 72 years old, with high blood pressure, and—" "Was she on any new medications?" Frank interrupted. Richard blinked, thrown off balance by the question. What? New medications, Frank repeated. Did her doctor recently prescribe anything new? Fie. That's none of your business, Richard stammered. But something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first shadow of doubt. Frank took a breath. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Holloway told me her doctor wanted to try a new medication for her blood pressure. Something from your company, sir. She was nervous about it, because she said you'd been pushing it hard at work, trying to get it approved faster. She said she was doing it to support you, even though the side effects scared her. The color drained from Richard's face. She told me it made her feel strange, Frank continued, his voice gentle now. Dizzy, disconnected. She said her heart would slow down so much sometimes that she felt like she was barely breathing. I told her to call her doctor, but she said she didn't want to let you down. You'd been so proud when the FDA approved it. Richard stood frozen, his mind racing. The new drug Cardioxin Plus, his flagship project, the medication that was supposed to revolutionize blood pressure treatment and add hundreds of millions to the company's bottom line. He'd been so focused on the launch, the marketing campaign, the stockholder presentations, that he hadn't even asked his mother how she was feeling when she mentioned she was taking it. Mr. Holloway, the funeral director said softly. Perhaps we should call an ambulance, Richard said suddenly, his voice hoarse. Now, sir. Call an ambulance, Richard shouted, all his composure shattering, and get someone who knows how to check for a pulse properly. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos. The funeral director, who had basic medical training, carefully checked Margaret's neck, her wrist, then placed his ear near her mouth. His face went pale. There's something, he whispered, very faint, but I feel something. The ambulance arrived, with sirens wailing. Paramedics rushed over with equipment, checking vital signs with practiced efficiency. One of them, a woman in her 40s, looked up with wide eyes. She's alive, she said, her voice filled with disbelief. Barely, but she's alive. Pulse is extremely weak, maybe 10 beats per minute. Blood pressure is dangerously low. It's like her entire system has been severely suppressed. They lifted Margaret from the casket with careful urgency, placing her on a stretcher, hooking her up to monitors and oxygen. The machines began to beep steadily, confirming what seemed impossible. Richard stood watching, his hands shaking, his face ashen. Around him, mourners were crying, some from relief, others from shock. His carefully controlled world had just shattered completely. As the paramedics loaded Margaret into the ambulance, Richard turned to find Frank. The garbage collector was standing off to the side, his cap in his hands, watching with quiet concern. How did you know? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank shrugged slightly. I didn't know for certain, but when I saw the funeral notice in the paper yesterday, something felt wrong. Mrs. Holloway and I talked every week about everything: her garden, her memories of your father, her worries about you working too hard. She told me last Wednesday that she loved you more than anything in the world, but she was scared you'd forgotten how to be her son instead of just a businessman. Richard's throat tightened. She said, if anything ever happened to her. Frank continued, she hoped you'd finally slowed down long enough to remember what really mattered. That seemed like the kind of thing someone says when they know they still have time left to say it. It didn't sound like someone ready to leave. I should have been there, Richard said, his voice cracking. I should have asked about the medication. I should have. You can do all those things now, Frank said gently. That's the gift you've been given, a second chance. 3 weeks later, Margaret Holloway sat in her sunny living room, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket, sipping tea. She'd made a full recovery, though the doctors said it was nothing short of miraculous. The medication had indeed caused a severe reaction, slowing her system so dramatically that she'd appeared dead. By the time of the funeral, she'd been in what the doctors called a near-death state, alive, but barely. Her vital signs so suppressed they were almost undetectable. If Frank hadn't stopped the funeral, if they'd proceeded with the burial. Margaret didn't like to think about it. Instead, she focused on the present moment, on the warmth of the sun through her window, on the taste of chamomile tea, on the sound of her son moving around in the kitchen, making lunch. Richard had taken a leave of absence from the company. He'd also immediately pulled Cardioxin Plus from the market, pending a full investigation. Despite the financial hit, some things, he'd told the shocked board members, were more important than profits. He'd been living with his mother for the past 3 weeks, helping her recover, talking with her for hours about things they'd never discussed before, about his childhood, about his father, about the years that had slipped away while he'd been building his empire. There was a knock at the door, and Margaret smiled. "That'll be Frank," she called to Richard. Her son opened the door, and there stood Frank Delgado, holding a small potted plant with bright red geraniums. "Mrs. Holloway," Frank said warmly, stepping inside. "You're looking wonderful." "Thanks to you," Margaret said, her eyes shining. Frank waved a hand dismissively. "I just trusted my gut." Richard extended his hand to Frank, and this time, unlike that day at the cemetery, his handshake was warm and genuine. "Stay for lunch?" he asked. "Please." And so they sat together around Margaret's old oak dining tabula. Billionaire, a garbage collector, and the woman who'd brought them together. They ate simple sandwiches and talked about ordinary things: the weather, the neighborhood, Frank's grandchildren, Margaret's garden, plans for spring. Richard realized, as he listened to Frank tell a story about a raccoon getting into someone's trash cans, that he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this peaceful, this present, this aware of life simply happening around him. "You know what I've learned?" Margaret said suddenly, looking at both men with affection. "The people who see us most clearly aren't always the ones closest to us. Sometimes they're the ones who show up every Wednesday morning at 6:30, rain or shine, and take the time to ask how we're doing." Frank smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "And sometimes," he said, "the people who seem too busy to care are just people who forgot how, but they can remember. That's the beautiful thing about life. It keeps giving us chances to remember what matters." Richard reached over and squeezed his mother's hand, something he hadn't done since he was a child. Outside, the autumn leaves were beginning to turn gold and crimson. Inside, 3 people who might never have truly known each other were discovering the quiet joy of genuine connection. Sometimes the most important moments in life arrive in the most unexpected ways: in a garbage truck, rumbling down a cemetery road, in the courage to speak up when something feels wrong, in the wisdom to recognize a second chance when it's offered. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to learn that it's never too late to slow down, to pay attention, to remember that the richest life isn't measured in dollars, but in moments like these: simple, honest, and beautifully, perfectly real. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. If it touched your heart, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps me continue sharing these stories with you. Please leave a comment below telling me what this story meant to you. Read every single one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe you've had your own second chance, or maybe you've been the Frank in someone else's life. Whatever your story is, I'd be honored if you'd share it. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.